this podcast, we will be looking at storytellers, stories, and the reasons that oral storytelling is important in our world today. You would think with all the technology we have available that stories do not have a place anymore, but they are needed more than ever. For in storytelling is where we find truth, we find reality, and we find the heart of what it is to be human. Welcome to the heart of storytelling. My name is Alyssa Curtain, and let's go on an adventure.
Welcome to this week's episode. I spoke with Queensland storyteller Bettina Nissen, who has been telling for a long time. I met Bettina at the Australian Fairy Tale Conference in 2022, and she told me a wonderful little thumb tale which I've been thinking about ever since, and her experience and wisdom, I really felt that when I was speaking to her at the time, and that's one of the reasons that I've got her on the show this week. So I hope you enjoy the podcast episode today. Welcome to this week's episode. Today we are speaking with Bettina Nissen, who is in Queensland in Australia. Did I say your name right?
It's actually Nissen.
Nissen.
N-I-S-S-E-N. And the reason that it's important, Alyssa, is that a Nis is a small Danish elf, and a group of Nis is Nissens. And so our family are all descended from the Nis elves, dwarves of Denmark. My father's side of the family were Danish.
Wow, that's an amazing story. I'm glad I got it wrong then. That's awesome. So tell me about the elves and magic sound like they're a part of your self, really. But tell me about your entry into storytelling.
Okay. I guess that a lot of things make a person a storyteller. I think that I come from a family of 5 sisters, and there's only 6 years between the oldest and the youngest, and I'm directly in the middle. So I am at the middle. But I guess that my real introduction to storytelling came from being a children's librarian. And my first job as a children's librarian was in 1980, so a long time ago. And it was in Mackay in central Queensland. And it was a brand new, beautiful library in a rapidly growing community. It was when the mining towns were just developing on the outside of that area. And this brand new award-winning architecturally designed library had a sunken storytelling pit. And so from the very beginning, I sat down with a book and started to read to children. However, of course, reading to children is a wonderful thing to do, but when you've got a lot of rambunctious 2 to 3-year-olds, they tend not to want to sit. And also at that stage, I was so new, I had no idea what was the right story for the right group. And so I was very lucky. After about 6 months, I was funded to go to a workshop in Rockhampton, which is about a 4-hour drive away. And that workshop was being run by Patricia Scott. Now, you may not have heard of Patricia Scott. She was one of Australia's very first Anglo-European professional storytellers. And she had a big impact on a lot of the older storytellers across Australia. So I went down to Rockhampton, and the one thing that Patricia Scott said is, bring a story ready to tell. You're not going to be using a book, so bring a story ready to tell. And so I drove the 4 hours down there. I was very excited. And Pat Scott turned on the storytelling light. What she said is, put the book aside. When you're working, a story is a living, breathing, dynamic interaction between the tellers and the listeners. And if you want children to sit and listen, then put the book aside. The illustrated book is a prop, just like a puppet or just like a felt board. But the real connection with storytelling is heart to heart, word of mouth, and that's what you will need to do to get 40 or 50 rambunctious 2 to 3-year-olds and their parents listening and enjoying the session. wow, it was such a huge leap, such a very big leap to put that book aside. But then I realized when I got back that I actually knew a lot of stories anyway. Like most people, I knew all the well-known classics. So I already knew Gingerbread Man. I already knew most of the fairy tales. And what I needed to learn was what was suitable to tell to 3-year-olds and what worked with 9 to 12-year-olds. And you learned that pretty quickly, because when you learn as a storyteller in the midst of telling, you know what works and you know what doesn't work. And I certainly found that that audience of very young children are the most discriminating audience that there is. They do not put up with you if you are not doing something that is intriguing and entertaining and interesting to them. And so I started to realize what were the stories that spoke the truth to that age group. And of course, the first one, which is a great classic of mine that I still love very much to this day, is Gingerbread Man. And I immediately realized that the Gingerbread Man was like a 2 or 3-year-old toddler. Actually thought they could run as fast and faster than everybody else, and that no one could touch them, and that they would giggle and laugh and they could trick everyone, just like playful toddlers are. And once I realized that that was the story I was telling, and that all those children sitting in front of me, even the quiet ones, had their times when they wanted to just run and hide and trick and get away and bamboozle the adults around them, then I knew that I was telling a story that would speak directly to their truth. And so I discovered what stories suit what age groups. Yeah.
Oh, that's awesome. And so obviously you've moved on into adults and other audiences now.
So that, as I said, was a long time ago. My initial librarianship career went from 1980 to 1989. And I left Mackay, I went to Gladstone. I ended up as the young people's librarian at the State Library of Queensland. And that was a really big growth time for me as well, because I then was in an advisory role for children's librarians and children library staff all around the state. And so I was in the position of being able to say, then put the book aside. The book can be taken home, the book can be read at night before bed, but when you're telling in a group to children, put the book aside and let the story do the work that it will do.
Mm-hmm.
And so I loved working at State Library. I loved that position, but I really missed the day-to-day contact you have with children in a public library, which is very busy and which is always filled with children and families. And so I actually left State Library. I left, and my first professional storytelling job was at Expo 88.
Wow.
And once I decided to leap out of the world of bureaucracy and leap into the world of being a performer and a freelance artist, that was a fantastic opportunity. My first job was telling outside the Canadian tent at World Expo 88. And it was street performing. And there were very long queues. I'm sure you probably don't remember, but there used to be huge queues. You'd be way too young. Outside all of the embassies and all of the exhibits. And so they employed people to entertain the people in the queue. And so very quickly, I was actually in a position where I was having to move up and down, hold an audience, choose a story that was going to work, do a few jokes, no props, no chance for props. So just go in there and work with the story and the audience and let the audience participate. So lots of improvisation. And, but of course, Expo 88 didn't last that long and it was over. And that's when I was fortunate, because I'd had that position at State Library. I knew basically every school, every library in the whole of Queensland. And so I was then able to get tours. And so I started straight away touring through the priority country areas program to very isolated places. And once again, you get in a car, you get a plane out to somewhere like Longreach, you get in a hire car and you drive thousands of kilometres through desert, past where the dinosaurs were, up to Mount Isa and then across to Greenvale mining And in all of those, you're stopping at really little schools. So you're stopping and a very big First Nations population. You have to be funny, you have to be flexible, but mostly you have to absolutely love what you're doing. And so those first years when I was touring in those areas, it was just wonderful. So you learn what works and what doesn't work, and you just keep on. And if it doesn't work, you put that story aside, no matter how much you love it. I can remember learning and rehearsing stories, driving those long kilometres, and then getting there and finding that it didn't suit that audience at all. So drop that idea immediately. They might be 12 to 14. So a story that I had in mind for city kids that would be that age would not suit them at all. Their whole interest in life would be different. So let's go in and find a story. And of course, the best stories are folk tales because they're very old and they're about our humanity. So it didn't matter if you lived in the middle of the desert or if you lived in the western suburbs of Brisbane, you could still find a story that was a folk tale that would speak to their truth. And that became my passion.
Yeah. So do you primarily tell folk tale?
Just about completely. I do, of course, over the years, like we're still talking up till the early 90s. By the time it got to the early 90s, I started to get really worn out. Touring is very exhausting. And I was really struck by the fact that when I'd go into the lunchroom at the school at lunchtime, all the teachers would start to tell me their story. Now, it wasn't just that they were stuck in the middle of nowhere. That's the impact of storytelling. Story begets story begets story. And just like I might be telling to a group of children, and it might be Jack and the Beanstalk, in the middle, because they're so involved in the story and they so want to receive that gift of a story and then give a gift back, they will jump into the story and add stuff in. So they'll, in the middle of a story, they'll say something like, my granddad caught a fish this big, nothing to do with the story. And I recognize that as reciprocal gift giving, because what they're experiencing is having such a profound effect. They love it. They're excited by it. It's word of mouth. They're making pictures in their heads so quickly. There's no illustrator, there's no TV, there's no filmmaker. Boy, where did those pictures come from? They're unique to me. Now, they'll be made up of what they know. So it might include something like Shrek as an ogre, but it will also include the drover on the cattle property. It'll also include the nasty, mean teacher, and it'll include the local parish priest. That's the pictures they're making in their head while they're listening to a story about an ogre and a little boy who triumphs over an ogre. And so they will jump in, and then all afterwards, children love that interaction. They're so moved by it and they're so engaged. And then I'd find I'd go and sit down at lunchtime and I'd be so tired and just completely wrung out with still 3 more sessions that afternoon. And the teachers would do exactly the same thing. But what they'd tell me would be their personal stories because it went straight to their heart. And also the interaction and the power of that interaction went straight to their hearts. And so I found that extraordinary. And the amazing thing about touring in those sorts of areas is that at first I used to be billeted, and so I'd always be staying with the local arts council person or the local teachers. But of course, they just want to go on all night long. They're so thrilled to have someone interesting come to town. And so you'd do like 5 sessions in a day, and then you'd get taken to the pub, have a fantastic, huge pub meal, and then you'd go back and half a dozen other teachers or people would turn up, and they'd want to just party on. And it was exhausting. You just can't do it. And then get up and get in the car and drive another 380 kilometres to the next town and start all over again the next day. So I had to say, I will not be billeted anymore. I will not be billeted. I need you to pay for a motel. Well, I can tell you there's a lot of stories about cockroach-ridden motels and unbelievable places that you stay in those little tiny outback towns. However, it meant that when I got back after telling, I could have a cold shower, I could sleep for 3 or 4 hours. I could then go and have dinner if everyone wanted to meet at the pub. I could finish dinner and I could go back and I could sleep. So it is an exhausting lifestyle. And mostly you tour on your own. On occasion, I did tour with other people, or else I'd meet other artists there. Like a famous one that I did down the Birdsville track, I ended up with an artist who'd come up from Adelaide, and she was working in this tiny school. It was 6 students in this school, very, very isolated. Baduri is the name of the town. And as soon as I got there, I was told that Baduri was the place where all the winds met. So it was a very wild, even though it might only have 6 students. Of those, there was one non-Indigenous student. So there weren't many, but they were very full on. And this woman was an artist, and she was working with their drawings and paintings. And that was wonderful, because then you could tell the story and they'd illustrate it and make murals and turn it into tiles and putting it on the wall and stuff like that. However, it got to the stage where I thought, wow, what am I going to do about all these stories I hear from people? And so I went and did initially a 10-week art therapy course. It was run at QUT, and that was fantastic, because I just wanted to know, what is it that story begets story, that people will completely divulge their stories to me, a complete stranger, in the lunchroom at the middle of the day? And so I learned about some of the basics, and that made me think, okay, I'm going to go and do another degree. And so for 2 years at night, I did a grad dip counselling, and that was fantastic. What I learned in that was, of course, not that I wanted to be a counsellor. I learned all the theory behind what was happening, all the interactions, and I also learned that it was group work that I wanted to do. So the subject that I really loved and excelled at in that wasn't individual counselling, it was group work. And group work is what I did. And so I started to get jobs in community arts, and I started to balance out my work between performing and community arts work. And the beauty of community arts work is that you'd get like a residency for 3 or 6 months. And so you'd get to work in one place. And that was fascinating. It might be a neighbourhood centre. I used to work in the women's prisons. I worked in youth detention centres. I worked with people and groups like the youth advocacy group. And once again, I'm telling stories and I'm telling folk tales, but the purpose had shifted. So now the purpose was that story begets story begets story. And so as I tell a story, that will immerse them in the conventions of story, and then they can start telling stories. And the purpose wasn't that they heal. The purpose wasn't any of those things. I didn't have to worry about that. What was the purpose is mouth open, story jump out. And then I usually worked with a series of either social workers, youth workers, or as the work became more refined, therapists. And that was fantastic. My role as a storyteller was extraordinary, but no one else was doing anything like it. Absolutely no one else in Australia. And even reading and researching all around the world, there was therapeutic storytelling, but it was a narrative style like I'd learned at uni in an individual one-on-one counselling setting. What was like it was community arts work. So people who worked with paints, people who worked with street theatre in South America. So I did lots of research, but I knew that I would need to have supervision, because you can't work in extraordinary circumstances like that and not have someone to debrief with. I was still telling folk tales. What I was doing now is I'd tell the folk tales so far, and then I'd say, so what do you think happened next? And they would have to come up with an alternate ending or a different ending if they didn't like the one that was there. So if the story finished in violence, they would think, well, is that the way you want the story? It is the way it finishes. And sometimes they'd say, yes, we want justice. He was a mean, mean, mean ogre. We want to have his head chopped off. But other times they would want to think of a different way, especially in work in the detention centre where it so reflected their own life. And they knew that the ogre was misunderstood just like they were. So by this stage, we're looking at about I think it was about 95, and I saw a little ad in the paper. I decided to move with my partner to Melbourne. So I saw a little ad in the paper and it said, wanted an action researcher for a pilot program run by Berry Street in Melbourne that was a women and children survivors of violence. Now, by that time, I'd actually done 17 small projects working with women and children in refuges and surviving violence. So I had lots of small projects, sometimes 6 weeks, sometimes only 4, and sometimes longer, but not very long. And I thought, you know what, that sounds interesting. I will send them what I do and my resume, my CV, see what happens. So I got the job. And we relocated to Melbourne, and my position was evaluator. So my job was action research evaluation using storytelling as the methodology. They took a risk taking someone like me, but it was an extraordinary project, and it was funded through the Sydney Myer Foundation, won a Best Practice Award. We ran it for 3 full groups. I worked with 7 therapists, and they were therapists from different organisations in the north of Melbourne. So some children protection, some neighbourhood centres, some community agencies. They all had a therapist each participating, and it was 3 groups. And there was a preschool age group, primary school age group, and a mother's group. There was no men. Most of the men, in order to qualify for the program, were in jail. They were extremely violent. So the children and the women had experienced a lot of trauma, and they were 6 months away from that relationship before they could qualify for the program. My job as storyteller/evaluator was to move from group to group for the first hour and a half when they were all separate. And then in the last half hour, the families would come back together, and I would listen as I moved from group to group. I'd think, okay, this week I can think of a folktale that will match these themes. Say it was about custody. So I'd think of a story like To Whom Do I Belong? And I would go back and the group would come together and I would tell the story to a certain part. And then I'd say, so what do you think is an ending to that story? And they would come up with a different ending. It was remarkable. It wasn't remarkable just because of my work. It was remarkable because the model was so good. The women, of course, took a lot longer to move through the process than the children. And of course, the preschool children were working through play, whereas the primary school age children were working through art and storytelling. So all different methods, and they'd come together at end, and you know, they might know that they'd said something that would incredibly upset their mother, like how much they missed their dads, even though they knew that he caused their family such grief. And so I would think, okay, what story will suit, what folktale? And fortunately, folktale from all around the world, it has it all. I don't tell First Nations stories, to let you know that, because they're not my stories. I tell stories mainly from a Western European tradition. I do tell some African stories, and I also tell some Vietnamese stories that are in the public domain, but I do not tell any Aboriginal stories. And so, but there's such a lot. Folk and fairy tales, there's so many that are so applicable because they're usually about the major themes of life: injustice, powerlessness, hunger, poverty, homelessness. You think about most of them, that's what they are: abandonment, betrayal. And so there was a huge amount. Of course, the basic skill I needed to have was a big repertoire of stories that I could draw on. And by that stage, I'd had going on for 15, 16 years, and only about 8 years since I'd stopped being a librarian. But I had a lot of years of loving folktale and researching folktale and building a repertoire. And very different audiences. So very varied, and you'd have to be able to adapt at the drop of a hat. So that first job that I had, apart from libraries at Expo 88, improvising outside the Canadian Pavilion, had been invaluable, absolutely invaluable. And building on that, all of the different groups. Of course, I did work with adult groups. I worked with, I got funding through, in those days, it was called Bureau of Ethnic Affairs, all that. Now, all of that time, Alyssa, I paid for my own supervision because I knew that I couldn't do the work I did without having regular supervision. Sometimes I had 2 supervision sessions a week. And the sort of supervision I sought from the time I was in Brisbane was psychodrama, because psychodrama, I love role play. It's about stories and narratives. I could get totally immersed in it, and it suited me really well. So all of that time I had been involved in psychodrama groups and psychodrama supervision, and really loved it and found that it was very good for me and really helped me crystallize a lot of the issues of what happened. I did that for 3 years in Melbourne, and then I needed to go back and work in libraries. I was so exhausted and so emotionally drained. I couldn't do it anymore. I just couldn't, even with supervision, because it's so sad. I used to come home and have a shower and just sob in the shower of the stories that I'd heard. And so I knew that I was getting to a stage where I couldn't keep doing that. And I needed to do it in a different way. But I was evaluated, so I actually had to write that document up. I had to write that document up, which was over 10,000 word document, and have it launched. And the thing that's great about it is, yes, it did win a Good Practice Award, but of course it was too expensive. There's no way that the number of women and children that are fleeing violence and needing therapy, they could afford to have 7 therapists working with a group in that model. However, it was a fantastic model, and there was some adaptation of it into different settings. I went back to work in libraries, and I love libraries. Libraries were so easy by comparison, and so structured, but also because I've always just wanted to be a children's librarian. So by that stage, I'm working in the eastern suburbs of Melbourne. I was at Doncaster, and I had story times with 60 plus that were turning up because there was a really big Chinese community, and there was just, I was in an area where the grandparents and the mums would bring their children. They were not necessarily working. And of course, that was fantastic. I mean, it was like bliss, storyteller bliss, to have those sorts of audiences and a consistently the same audience, which isn't what happens when you work as a touring storyteller. You get a different group every few days. If you're lucky, you might get asked back to that kindy 2 or 3 times a year. Mostly not. Once a year is all they can afford. And so working in a library where you've got the same group of children coming every week is just fantastic. Yeah. And you build up such a rapport with those children and with those families that, my favourite story is walking through shopping centres and looking down the aisle, and there will be a mum with her 3 or 4-year-old kneeling down and saying, "Who do you think that is? Who's that down the end of the aisle?" And the child goes, and run full pelt down to a hub. And that happened in cities as well. And so that's what I did for a few years. I then ended up coming back. My parents were getting very old, and I wanted to come back to Queensland. So when I came back to Queensland, I mean, I still toured again. I did touring in Victoria for about 2 years through the Storytelling Garden, which was a wonderful agency to work for. It was great because they organised all the tours and used to just get in the car and drive and turn up at kindies and schools. And mostly I did all the country touring because the other tellers like Jackie Kerrin and people, they had children, small children. I didn't have children, so I didn't have to worry about that. And then I ended up going back into libraries. That's been the wonder. For me, I'm so lucky that I had librarianship as a career behind me, and that in those days, you still got employment as a children's librarian. Of course, that hardly exists, particularly in Queensland. There's not very many school librarians, and there's definitely not many children's librarians anymore. Everyone has to be able to do everything. But I was lucky. That wasn't the time when I was working in libraries. And so my whole time was devoted to to working and to storytelling, but also all the other things like book talking, visiting high schools, just building very strong connections with the community that I worked with. And yeah.
Oh wow, that's a great like when you ask where do you start, you just don't know where the story is going to go. But there's so much in that, and I've made a few notes here. There's a couple of things that you said that I want to go back to.
Yeah,
One
sure.
of them was because this podcast is called The Heart of Storytelling, and you've sort of mentioned them in passing. You talked about the heart-to-heart connection, and you also talked about the truth of story. Can you elaborate on those things?
Yeah, sure. Well, I guess what I discovered fairly quickly with storytelling, particularly folk tales, is that there's truth and there's truth. I use a lot of chanting, and so I use that chant that comes from Africa. I don't know if you know it. At the beginning of a session, even if they're teenagers or adults, I start off by saying, I'm going to tell you a story, and the audience has to say, right. And then I say, it's full of truth, right, but it's also full of lies, right. It doesn't really mean that absolutely everything I tell you is true, right. A story. Let it come, but you've got to remember with a story to let it go. If it be sweet or maybe not so sweet, keep some for yourself, share some with someone else, because there's no point to a story if you don't share it, and let some come back to me. So right from the word go, I establish with the audience that we are moving in and out of truth, but the real truth is the truth that speaks to you. So even though at the end of the story, there might be a child or an obnoxious 14-year-old who can't help themselves, it's their nature, who says, is that true, miss? Is that true? I'll just go straight back in the chant. I'll go straight back into the chant. And at that chant, at the beginning, if I've got a group of teenagers and they mess it up, which of course they can't resist. So I might say, I'm going to tell you a story. And instead of saying right, they'll say left. It's full of truth, but it's also full of lies. And instead of saying right, they'll say no. You know, they'll just can't resist it. But of course, my rule is, as I say, oh, we can't go on until we get the chant right, because the chant leads to the rules of the story space. And if you don't get the chant right, we can't tell the story. And so I'll just keep on going until they stop messing it up. Because of course, it doesn't matter if they're 14 or 15 or 4. They don't do that at 4 though.
No.
They really, really want to hear the story. They're longing. They're hungry for stories. They want that story. Their soul is crying out for that story. They don't know that, but part of them knows it intuitively. They want that story. They want that connection. Storytelling, like I said, right back in the beginning, from when Pat Scott said, and I learned deeper and deeper as the years went by, it's a dynamic interaction. So even though as tellers, we research the story, we learn the story, and then we go and we tell the story, as soon as you tell it, it changes. No story is ever the same twice. So something as simple as Gingerbread Man, then you think, how can that story change? Well, because every single child sitting listening and every adult has had a different experience on their way to the library that morning. Some of them, we don't know what happened at home. We don't have any idea. Some of them, it might have been an absolute delight, and some of them, it might have been heartbreaking. They're sitting there, and they will all bring that to the story space, and that is what's being fed in the nature of that interaction. And folktale is big enough to carry that. There's not a lot of stories that are big enough to carry that sort of human experience, and enough space to find your own place within it. Enough space that if the picture it sends you in your head is of your dad hammering your mum against a wall, there's enough space and containment within that story for that picture to come, and then to realize, oh, but hang on a sec, it's only the wolf. It's just the wolf. It's not real. And then another real picture is imposed on who that wolf is. But it's metaphorical. It's within that story space. It's contained. Now, of course, the work that needs to be done afterwards with that child will be done in the family, won't be done but we have given them the story. And that's what storytellers have been doing since the beginning of time, listening to the issues in their community, creating a story or choosing one from an ancestor, telling it to the group in metaphor. They pick up what is most relevant to them and apply it, and then find how it can be resolved, whatever the issue in that community is, or not resolved.
Oh, my heart. I'm crying. That was just, that really touched something deep in me. Like really powerful. Amazing. That's so beautiful. I'm gonna have to listen back.
Well,
Yeah.
so when you say what's the connection, it's the fact that we might have a story to deliver, but it's like delivering a baby. You know, it's delivering something that is living and ancient and old and has so much to say. Now, of course, it's good to remember that we're telling that in a 20th century or 21st century, detention centre to teenagers who've been breaking and entering since the age of 8. And I'm delivering them this story. What are they going to do? Do I need to change the story a bit? Do I need to bring it up to the 20th century? Sometimes you do. I trust the story. I trust folktale, and the fact that folktale is usually filled with archetypes. And so what might be a peddler or a beggar is a poor person, a homeless person. What might be a king is Donald Trump. What all of those, they have very clear parallels to the creatures and the people that are around today. Metaphor is only that thin, you know. Children, toddlers, they dive straight in. Sometimes when they're listening, there's no metaphor at all, because they are the gingerbread man, or they are Jack climbing that beanstalk because he has to be able to prove to his mum that he can provide for her. He can do it. She doesn't have to be that cross with him anymore. It doesn't, metaphor is very thin for children. They just leap straight in. And adults, metaphor keeps them safe. So if they're finding that it's touching them very deeply, if they're finding that it's very confronting, then they can just say it's just a stupid old story. But the story will keep doing its work. Story doesn't stop, even if they're in their defensiveness, they're feeling that. But you know what? The majority of people, very, very, very few people say that's just a stupid old story, because they've had a chance to jump out of their present day world into this story space where anything and everything is negotiable. So all the arguments and the things that people put forward, which is, you know, what does an old fairy tale have to have and say to us in this day and age, is because they don't actually listen long and still enough. And unfortunately, we have had Disney, and Disney has taken it and also, right from the Grimm brothers, changed the stories. But with a good teller, which is what is our duty, our responsibility, to tell that story, to deliver that story to those people with all their different lives from the ancestors on, then even if they're confronted and even if they reject it, they will know what the story is doing. It will come to them.
Amazing. I've been doing a bit of research on the fairy tales, and even the women of the salons used to say they were just trifles. The stories were so unimportant, and I think it's a way for adults then to compartmentalize it in a way, which goes back to what you're saying. So are you able to tell us a story?
Yes, I will. But I will say, first of all, about the women of the salon. Even though they created their own fairy tales, they used the framework of fairy tale, and they used it as metaphor, which was very important because they were in very dangerous situations frequently, as your salon series explored. And they realized the magic of imagination, and how imagination can lead you on such a journey, and then bring you back. And in that journey, you will have learned so much that even in those situations, those very difficult situations they were often in, they were able to create those stories as a journey, go on that journey, get insights, think about different ways, and other people would contribute different ways in which that story could unfold just through discussion, laughter, giggling, and teasing. And so the outcome would be the same because they used that structure. They used the fairy tale structure and made it completely applicable to their own situation, took it as their own and used it. Yeah. Now I'm going to tell you a story, which is a very short story. And this has a fairy tale, a folktale structure, but it's actually a story created by Leela Berg. And I tell it a lot with young children, and it's a delight. It's called The Grandma. Once there was a little boy who went to stay with his grandma. His grandma had a very long back garden. I'm frightened to go to the bottom of my garden, said the grandma. There's a troll that lives there, and he is wild with me, thumping me here and bumping me there. Oh, Grandma, said the little boy, hold my hand. And the little boy and the grandma went up and down the garden, up and down, quite safely until the moon had risen and it was time to go in for dinner and bed. Well, the very next morning, that little boy woke up, first of all, and he went out of his bedroom, down the stairs, into the back garden. He went past the vegetable garden, past the compost heap, all the way to the bottom of the garden. And there was a very big prickle bush. But when he got to the bottom of the garden, who should jump out but the troll? And the troll said, I am sick and tired of the way you are so careful with your grandma. I'm going to throw her so high in the sky, she'll fall in the prickle bush. Oh, no, said the little boy, not the prickle bush. But you know what that troll did? Threw grandma right in the prickle bush. And the little boy had to help her climb out. And they went upstairs and he washed all the scratches and he put ointment on the scratches. Soon grandma was just as good as new. Well, the next morning, that little boy woke up. And once again, he was the only one awake. And he went through the house, down the stairs, past the vegetable patch, past the compost heap, all the way to the bottom of the garden. And when he got to the bottom of the garden, what do you think happened? The troll jumped out. I am sick and tired of the way you take such good care of your grandma. I'm going to throw her in the compost heap. The compost heap. But you know what? The troll did. And the little boy had to help his grandma up out of the compost heap and take her back and sit her down and wash down all those scratches again and put more ointment on the scratches. And soon she was just as good as new. Well, the third morning he got up, got out of bed and he walked down those stairs, past the veggie patch, past the compost heap, all the way to the bottom of the garden. And when he got there, out jumped the troll. I am sick and tired of the way you take such good care of your grandma. I am going to... No, you're not, said the little boy. I am sick and tired of the way you are so mean to my grandma, thumping her here and bumping her there. I am going to throw you so high in the sky, you'd never come back. And you know what? He did. And after that, that little boy and his grandma were just as good as new. And that is the end of that. I always finish stories with that, and that is the end of that. And as an interesting aside, during the violence programs when I was doing that, and I'd finish all the stories with, and that is the end of that. It didn't take very long, I never suggested it, for the families to pick up that finality, and the children would start to have an argument. And then at the end they'd say, and you know what, Mum? That is the end of that. And it became something they could use just by listening in the story space.
I guess so. A couple of the things there for me as a emerging storyteller is you have something that you start with and something that you end with. Does that help you to get
Yes.
in and out of the spaces?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Really important. And it's an excellent piece of advice. And I'm sure you'll find that many storytellers around the world, even those that work in schools, even those that are teachers that are using story, all the different places, there is such a repertoire of traditional chants and rhymes, and different people have different endings. But if you do some research, the book that I first found most useful is actually published in 1987. It's a long time ago, and it's called Storytelling Process and Practice. And in that, the authors have a list of traditional openings and traditional endings from different cultures all around the world. Now, once again, you have to choose the ones that suit you. They're there in the public domain, so you do have the right to use them, but you have to decide, looking at your audience and the cultural mix of your audience, which would be the best to use. And it's often a good idea to just let the audience know. Like I might say, I'm going to tell you a story that's not of my culture, but it's a story I've heard ever since I was little. So even though it's not from the same place that I come from, it's a story that lives in my heart, and sort of give them a bridge to go. Of course, you make that decision beforehand. You decide what is a culturally appropriate story for you to tell. And then you choose from what stories are available and what stories speak to your truth. You asked me about story truth. I think I said before, story truth is the truth that speaks to you, regardless of if it's a fable or if it's a crazy, clownish journey. It's still about you. It's a story about being human. So yes, using traditional openings and endings, finding the ones that suit you. It's also a great tool, Alyssa, because it will help the audience focus and settle. So one of the reasons I do the chants, and with very small children, it might be as simply as roly-poly, up, roly-poly, roly-poly. Simple chants will open, shut them, open, shut them. Focus, 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 still, ready to receive. When you're little, as you know, you don't actually find sitting still easy. So choose stories as short as the grandma. That's actually about, it can be as long as 20 minutes, but it can also be as short as 5, even 3, if you want it to be.
Yeah, no, amazing. So do you have any other advice for emerging and beginner storytellers?
Listen to other tellers. Have as much contact as possible with other storytellers. So if you're in an isolated place, or as in my day when there weren't that many tellers around in those early days, now we can look at podcasts. Now we can tune into storytellers and storytelling sessions from all over the world on Zoom. But, you know, it's great to go to festivals. Go to every festival you possibly can. Now, they cost a fortune. And so you have to save up and apply if you want to tell and give a workshop, because storytellers aren't people that make an enormous amount of money in their lives. We're always going to be, even if you have a mix of what you work like I did with community arts. In the end, my last 7 years of my working life, I went back to libraries because I didn't have enough super. And I could just see, wow, in all these years and all the wondrous, amazing working life I've had, the wonderful time, I don't have enough super to get me through my old age. And so fortunately, I once again relocated and I went back to Gladstone, where I'd worked in 1984 and spent the last years as a children's librarian in Gladstone, because they still had a children's librarian's position, thank God. And so yes, listen to other tellers. Go to as many, and I mean, those tellers will tell in so many different ways. So from our Western European tradition, you've got lots of chances at festivals around Australia, podcasts, and storytelling Zooms. But listen to other cultural tellers and recognize how different storytelling is for example, First Nations people. That it's not like Western European storytelling, that it serves the same purpose, I really believe, but it's got a completely different way of being. Learn from that. You won't use it, but listen listen.
Yeah.
Story is used to trace kinship lines when those kinship lines have been severed and
Mm.
people have been in all different parts and lost track of family.
Mm.
Even before it was about country, where you live, place. Now, so many of Western European fairy tales are also about family and about place and where we come from and who we are. First Nations is still in its absolute, truthful, authentic form. So the story will be about Auntie so-and-so, she ended up going here and they ended up there and we didn't find her, or even her daughter for 40 years. But it's reeling people back in and letting them know who they are and where they come from, and that where they come from is who we are. Yeah.
So would you, I mean, that's an interesting thought. Is the hardest story that they are telling us our story? It's telling us who we are and where we come from.
That's exactly it. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's what I say. Storytelling tells us, stories tell us who we are, where we come from, and even where we might be able to go when it's happily ever after. Happily ever after is not happily ever after. Happily ever after is there's a future out there, so chase it.
Yeah.
Find what it is, and at least make sure it's a future where you have some happiness. So if in the past, in the rest of that story behind you, it was not very good, you got a poison apple from your stepmother, or your brother grew a black crow's wing. I mean, all of those things can happen, and they do, whatever they're a metaphor for. But the happily ever after is saying, hang on, in the future, it can be different. So where we come, who we are, where we come from, and even where we might be able to go. Yeah.
Amazing. What a beautiful way to end our podcast today. So if people are interested in your work and working with you, where can they find you?
Well, I'm retired. I still do lots of storytelling, needless to say. So I now live in Deception Bay, and I can give you my email address. I am an active member of the Australian Fairy Tale Society. I also really base my telling in my community. So I go to the local schools. I coordinate a volunteer-led early literacy program, and that is actually, Deception Bay has a very diverse community. And so it's wonderful. We go to playgroups, we go to kindies, and we sing and rhyme and tell stories. We get the children to tell us stories. I go to the babies group, 0 to 6 months, and you wouldn't believe the impact it has. When I've got my little Humpty Dumpty figure, they actually start to mimic the movements after 2 visits.
Yeah.
I just do Humpty Dumpty, and it's an hilariously funny story. So yeah, I'd say that if people want to find me, they can find me. I don't know if I'm on very many films or anything. I don't know, but yeah, they can contact me via my email.
Yeah.
And they can, they can. So I'll give you and I've got a Facebook page, but it's just a personal Facebook page. It's got lots about storytelling and living in Deception Bay.
Have you got a website?
No.
No.
I don't. I'm not an active storyteller anymore. I'm just active in that I'm busy 6 days a week volunteering.
Oh, that's amazing. Well, thank you so much for joining me today and taking time out of your day to have a chat.
It's a pleasure. Thank you, Alyssa.
Well, that's our episode for today. I hope you've enjoyed learning about storytelling and folktale, fairy tale, myth, legend, or personal tales, wonder tales, all sorts of stories, and the art of storytelling and why we really need to continue using it today. You can find more information about me at alyssacurtain.com or at Alyssa Curtain Stories on Facebook, Instagram, YouTube and TikTok. I hope that you can find your heart in storytelling.